She woke up that morning already knowing, not with certainty, not yet, but the way you know things, in the place behind your ribs, before your mind has finished its argument. She had been sleeping in the same bed as her husband, and that bed had been getting colder for months. And you cannot share a bed with someone for 10 years and not feel when they leave without moving. You can feel it in the temperature of the air between you. You can feel it in the rhythm of their breathing when you lie awake at 2 in the morning, listening and wondering. You can feel it in the way they answer their phone out of the room, or the way they look at something on the screen of their computer just a half second before they close the window. You feel it long before you can prove it. Sometimes you feel it before it has even fully started. Her name was Clara Harris. She was 44 years old. She was a dentist. She was a mother of 3, 2 of them her own sons, and one of them her stepdaughter. She was a wife. She had been a wife for exactly 10 years and 5 months. And on the morning of July 24, 2002, she got out of bed in her house in Friendswood, Texas, and the first thought in her mind was the same thought that had been there every morning for months. Today. Today she was going to know. She had already made the necessary phone calls. She had already written the check. She had already hired the people she needed to hire. Now she had to wait. The house was large, worth more than $500,000. It sat in the suburb of Friendswood, which sits south of Houston, in the kind of Texas that is not dramatic. It does not have the romance of the desert or the grandeur of the hill country. It is flat, and it is hot, and it is subdivided into developments with cheerful names, and the people who live there have done the things that are supposed to produce a good life. They went to the right schools and found the right careers and married the right people and made the right investments. And now they live in houses with great rooms that open off kitchens and driveways that hold 2 or more good cars and children's bicycles on. The front porch and swimming pool memberships and soccer teams and Sunday morning church in a sanctuary that looks like a civic center auditorium. These are not people who are pretending. They genuinely believe the life they are living is the life they are supposed to be living. The belief is sincere, and the suburb is clean, and the sidewalks have no cracks. The problem with that belief is that it cannot account for everything. It cannot account for what happens when the most careful architecture of a life conceals something rotten inside one of the walls. And when that happens, when the rot makes itself known, the people in the clean suburb discover that there is no preparation for it. There is no class you take. There is no checklist you can consult. There is only the morning you wake up already knowing, and the question of what you do next. Clara Harris made coffee. She moved through the room she had paid for and helped design. She looked at the photographs on the walls. She checked the time. She waited. She had already hired the people she needed. Blue Moon Investigations occupied the 2nd floor of a Morgan Stanley office building on Bay Area Boulevard in Webster, Texas, and it was run by a woman named Bobby Barcher, who was 43 years old and who wore long dark dresses with granny boots, and who had a sing-song voice so cheerful and light that people who called her for the first time sometimes mistook her for a teenager. She was not a hard-boiled detective in the way of movies. She was something more useful than that. A woman who understood loss and deception and the specific grief of domestic betrayal, and who had organized her professional life around helping other people through it. Her office smelled like cinnamon candles. There were small gurgling fountains on the windowsills and framed photographs of the moon on the walls and long-vined potted plants that caught the light in the afternoons. She served constant comment tea to her clients, rather than coffee, because she had found, over years of this work, that tea was more soothing, that it gave people something to hold, that the slight ceremony of a cup placed in front of you when you sat down to explain the worst thing that was happening in your life was enough to slow the breathing by a fraction and make the telling easier. She understood that coming to a private investigator was one of the hardest and most humiliating decisions a person could arrive at. She wanted the environment to say, "You are not crazy. You are not alone. What is happening to you is real, and real people deal with it, and you came to the right place." Bobby understood marriage the way a mechanic understands engines. She had watched several fail. Her first husband had been her high school sweetheart, and he had left her for another woman when she was still young, and the experience had remade her in the specific way that certain betrayals remake a person. Not broken, not hardened, but permanently clearer about what people are capable of, and permanently gentler toward the people it destroys. Her second marriage had not worked either. She had raised 3 children, largely on her own, working surveillance jobs at night while her kids sat in the back seat of the car doing homework or leafing through comic books, occasionally falling asleep on the drive home. She was good at surveillance. She had done a job once that involved hiding under a dining room table with a tape recorder, and word had gotten around. She opened Blue Moon in 1995. She took out large ads in the area yellow pages. Need a clue? Call Blue. By the summer of 2002, Blue Moon was the most prominent private investigative agency in the suburbs south of Houston. She had 38 investigators. Most of them were women, most of them younger than Bobby, most of them working part-time between other lives. College students, school teachers, executive assistants, retail workers, following spouses through the subdivisions in the evenings with cameras and notebooks and the particular patience that observation requires. Bobby believed women were more naturally observant. She also employed a former male stripper as her chief investigator. Her third husband, Lucas, a Boeing engineer with a gift for mathematics and a tendency to forget which restaurant table was his after coming back from the restroom, occasionally did surveillance work for her when she was overbooked. The business was built on the domestic grief of the Houston suburbs. The astronaut's wife, who thought her husband was making out with a secretary on his lunch break at NASA, the husband who suspected his wife was meeting cowboys at a country western bar and bringing them back to the family suburban, the wife who wondered if the stress therapist her insurance executive husband was visiting weekly was something other than a therapist. The stories were endless. The neighborhoods were clean, and the lives inside the houses were not, and that discrepancy was Bobby Barcher's entire professional existence. Clara Harris had come to Blue Moon's offices on July 23rd, the Tuesday before this story ends. She sat down across from Bobby and explained what she needed. She was composed and direct. She was a professional woman who had spent her adult life organizing things: a dental practice, a household, a marriage, a family. She organized this the same way. She explained the situation. She stated what she needed. She wrote a check for over $1,500. 3 days of surveillance. She needed documentation, not feeling, not suspicion, not the thing that lived in her chest, something objective, something that could not be dismissed as jealousy or paranoia, something she could hold up and say, "Here, look, this is real." She signed the contract. The contract was explicit. She was not to appear at any surveillance locations. She was to wait for reports from the investigators and let them do their work without her presence complicating it or compromising the documentation. She agreed to this. She signed her name. She drove home to Friendswood, and she waited. And on the morning of July 24th, 2002, the waiting was already something like its own form of torture. Here is the minimum of backstory this day requires. 1 scene of context. Then back to the clock. Clara Suarez had been born in Bogota, Colombia. Her father died when she was young, and her mother raised her alone, without money, without the cushion that makes the future feel possible rather than theoretical. She had grown up watching her mother work with the single-minded focus of a person who knows that nothing is coming from anywhere except her own hands. Clara inherited that focus. She studied dentistry in Colombia, a serious field, a difficult field, requiring years of training and the kind of sustained concentration that does not come easily to people who are not genuinely committed to it. She was genuinely committed to it. In the late 1980s, she came to the United States. She completed further training and completed her residency at the University of Texas Houston Dental Branch. She was beautiful in a specific and memorable way. Thick reddish hair, a perfect smile, the kind of face that photographers notice. A small dark mole on her left cheek that gave her a distinctive quality, slightly unusual, slightly apart from conventional prettiness. Shortly after establishing herself in Houston, she entered a local pageant and was crowned Miss Columbia Houston. She wore the title easily, without vanity. It was not what she was about. She mentioned it occasionally, the way you mention a pleasant distinction, but it did not define her. What defined her was the practice she opened in Lake Jackson in 1993. What defined her was the work. She met David Harris in 1991 at the Castle Dental Center in Houston. They were both in their early 30s. He was an orthodontist who had graduated second in his class, who was brilliant at the specific technical artistry of moving teeth through bone over long periods of time, and who had a manner so naturally warm and unpretentious that patients trusted him immediately. His favorite word was golly. He used it reflexively, genuinely, the way certain people have verbal tics that are so authentically them that you stop noticing them after the first conversation. He called a friend after the first time he met Clara and told him he was completely smitten. Clara felt the same thing. They were together within weeks, and they were married within a year. Valentine's Day, 1992. The reception was at the Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel in Nassau Bay, Texas, across the highway from the Johnson Space Center, 30 miles south of downtown Houston. The rooms had views over the water. The night was warm. The champagne was cold. Everyone who was there would later remember it as exactly what it was. Two people who were unreservedly, unguardedly happy to have found each other, celebrating in front of everyone they cared about. That hotel, remember that hotel, it runs through this story like a fault line. David opened Space Center Orthodontics. The practice grew fast and large, as many as 120 patients a day through his offices, predominantly adolescents in braces, the ordinary and necessary corrective work of a successful suburban dental practice. He was exceptional at it. He was also charming and folksy enough that his patients' parents recommended him to other parents, and the recommendation network in the Houston suburbs is dense and efficient. The money was significant. Clara ran her own dental practice and was known among her patients for her warmth and her engagement. She lined the waiting room walls with framed photographs of herself and David, replacing them with new ones every few months. She called him 2 or 3 times every day from her desk, and she never ended a call without saying, "I love you." Not once in 10 years. In 1998, she gave birth to twin boys, Brian and Bradley. David had a daughter from his brief first marriage, Lindsay, who lived in Ohio with her mother during the school year and came to Friendswood every summer. Lindsay was a quiet, talented teenager, a violin player, and Clara had developed a genuinely warm relationship with her over the years. Step-parent relationships can be complicated, and Lindsay's was not by the accounts of people who knew the household. Clara made room for her. Lindsay accepted it. The co-workers, the patients, the friends who knew them, said the same thing in slightly different words. Clara loved David with an intensity that was slightly unusual, slightly beyond the ordinary domestic devotion, the kind of love that is complete and consuming and makes the person outside it feel slightly inadequate by comparison. It was always David, 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 one of her co-workers told a reporter, years later, that she had wished she could love her own husband the way Clara loved David. That is the house that was standing on the morning of July 24, 2002. That is the structure of the world. That is what was cracking. The affair had started, by most estimates, somewhere in the spring of 2002, approximately 3 months before this story ends. Gail Bridges was 39 years old. She had been a cheerleader in high school. She was petite and stylish, with skin described repeatedly by people who knew her as flawless, and eyes described as the color of almonds. And she had the kind of easy social confidence that comes from a certain kind of suburban upbringing, the kind where you are pretty and popular, and things come smoothly. She had been married to a State Farm insurance agent named Steve Bridges, and they had lived in a gated community called South Shore Harbor in League City, a suburb just across Interstate 45 from Friendswood. 3 children, a comfortable income. After their divorce was finalized in November 2000, she moved to a smaller house in an ungated neighborhood and started looking for work. In August 2001, she was hired as a receptionist at Space Center Orthodontics. She was making $1,800 a month, significantly less than she had been accustomed to, but the office was pleasant, and the orthodontist who ran it was easy to get along with. By late February 2002, David Harris was asking Gail to join him for lunch at Perry's restaurant. These were work lunches first, or they were positioned as work lunches. By April or May of 2002, depending on whose testimony you give weight to, the relationship had become something else. They began meeting at hotels, one hotel in particular, suited them. It was near the practice, near the water, and it had rooms with pleasant views of the bay. It was the Nassau Bay Hilton, the hotel where David Harris had held his wedding reception 10 years before. The hotel where he had danced with Clara in front of their families and their friends on Valentine's Day, 1992, in the specific joy of two people who have found the thing they were looking for. He took his mistress to the same hotel. He booked the rooms under an assumed name. He paid cash, so there would be no paper trail that Clara might stumble across. He returned multiple times. He must have walked through the lobby on those visits and seen, in the architecture of the building, the ghost of the evening that had happened there a decade before. What he thought about that, nobody can say with certainty. What a person tells themselves about the choices they make when they are living two lives simultaneously is a private and largely incoherent internal negotiation that rarely holds up to examination. Clara had confronted David about Gale Bridges approximately 2 weeks before July 24th. The confrontation had not been the first time she raised the subject. The weeks leading up to July 24th had involved conversations between them about the affair, about the marriage, about whether any of it could be salvaged. David made promises. He said he would end it. He said the things that people say when they are not yet ready to make the choice that cannot be unmade. Clara, who had structured her entire adult life and identity around this marriage, tried to believe him. The trying was not naive. She was not a woman who was easily fooled. She had come from Bogota with nothing and had built this life through clear-eyed effort. But the trying was sincere, because the alternative, accepting that the 10 years of I love you and the photographs on the walls and the twin boys and the dinners cooked on time every evening had been building toward this, was a kind of pain she was not ready to absorb. She could not stay in the trying forever. The trying failed. By the evening of July 23rd, she was sitting in Bobby Barcher's office in Webster, Texas, writing a check for $1,500 and agreeing, in writing, not to appear at surveillance locations. She drove home. She slept, and on the morning of July 24th, 2002, she woke up, already knowing. The morning passed with the specific texture of mornings that are waiting for something. The twins were home. Brian and Bradley were 3 years old, about to turn 4. They needed breakfast, and they needed attention, and they needed to be kept from danger in the way that 3-year-olds require continuous management. Clara provided these things. She moved through the kitchen and the living room and the yard with the boys in the efficient and practiced way of a mother who had been doing this for 3 years and who was also, simultaneously, somewhere else in her mind. Lindsay was home too. David's 16-year-old daughter, spending her summer in Friendswood the way she always spent it, sleeping in the house she had known every summer since she was a small child. Lindsay, who played violin. Lindsay, who had a good, warm relationship with her stepmother. Lindsay, who was 16 and who had, by Lindsay's own later testimony, been aware that something was wrong between her father and Clara in the weeks leading up to this day. David went to his office. 100 patients. The sounds of an orthodontic practice, the reception desk phone, the chair tilting, the children coming in and going out with their parents, the small adjustments and the follow-up appointments, and the ordinary business of a lucrative suburban healthcare practice. Gale Bridges was there, presumably the way she had been there since the previous August, handling the front desk. At some point in the afternoon, David left. He went to the Nassau Bay Hilton. He checked in under his assumed name with cash, the way he always did when he came here. He and Gale went upstairs together. They had been upstairs for approximately an hour and a half. The Blue Moon investigator was stationed in the parking lot, camera running. Here is what Bobby Barcher said later. Clara was in the area of the hotel before the investigators called her. She had been circling the parking lot, or was nearby in the vicinity of the hotel, an hour before Blue Moon contacted her to give her the location. She had signed a contract promising she would not appear at surveillance sites. She was at a surveillance site anyway, and she had been there for an hour already. What does this mean? The prosecution would say it means she had driven there with intent, that she had planned to be there, had positioned herself in advance, had been waiting for the confirmation she was about to receive, and that this constituted premeditation rather than sudden passion. The defense would say it means the woman could not stay in her house, could not sit on the couch and wait for a phone call about the worst thing that was happening in her life, that the knowledge was pulling her south the way a current pulls a swimmer, not because she had a plan, but because she had no capacity, in that state, to maintain the kind of distance between herself and her grief that the contract required. That she was there because she could not be there. Both readings are honest. Both are genuinely supported by the facts. This is why the jury deliberated 7 hours. A call came in the late afternoon. Her husband and Gail Bridges were at the Nassau Bay Hilton. They had checked in under an assumed name. They had been upstairs for approximately an hour and a half. Clara Harris put on a silky blue blouse and cream-colored slacks. She brushed her thick reddish hair and tied it in place with a small bow. The bow. Come back to the bow. The bow is where the entire argument about this woman's state of mind lives. The prosecution pointed to the bow as evidence of calculation. A woman who is about to accidentally kill her husband in a parking lot does not tie a bow in her hair first. The defense would have said, a woman who is going to walk into the hotel where she got married and confront the man she has loved for 10 years and the woman he chose over her wants to look her best, wants one thing in the day to be exactly right, wants to walk into that lobby looking like herself, like the woman in the waiting room photographs, like the woman who called him every day and never forgot to say I love you, like the woman who was worth choosing. The bow was not a plan. The bow was a declaration. It said, I am still here. I am still this. Whatever you have done, I am still the woman you married. She got into the silver S-Class 430 Mercedes-Benz. The car that she had told David was the only extravagance she cared about in life. The car that meant something specific to her, something beyond transportation or status. The car was proof, evidence, the physical record of a woman who had come from Bogota with nothing and a widowed mother and no safety net, and had crossed an ocean and built a dental practice and a house worth more than $500,000, and raised 3 children and loved a man completely for 10 years. The car was the accumulated evidence of all of that. She loved the car the way you love something that represents the entire arc of what you have done. She drove it south through the flat Texas suburbs with Lindsay in the passenger seat. Lindsay went with her. This fact is worth sitting with. David's daughter, 16 years old, in the car. She was spending the summer the way she always spent it. And now she was in the passenger seat of her stepmother's Mercedes, heading south toward Nassau Bay. Whether she knew where they were going or why is not clear in the record. What is clear is that she went. The Nassau Bay Hilton was quiet in the way that hotels are quiet in the early evening when the afternoon conferences have ended and the dinner crowd has not yet fully arrived. The lobby was cool with the aggressive air conditioning of Texas hotels. People moved through it in the ordinary distracted way of hotel guests, focused on their own purposes, not watching for anything. David and Gail had gone upstairs about an hour and a half earlier. They came back down in the early evening. The elevator opened. They stepped out into the lobby. Clara and Lindsay were standing there. The moment before anyone moved probably lasted less than a second. The time it takes to recognize a face and understand what the recognition means. And then Clara moved. She went for Gail. She lunged, and the words that came out of her were not random noise. They were specific, and they were precise, and they came from somewhere that had been building for months. You bitch. He's my husband. She slapped Gail. She grabbed her shirt. She did not stop there. She screamed it loud enough for every person in the lobby to hear. This is Dr. David Harris, and he's fucking this woman right here. She was announcing, she was demanding that the lobby, the hotel, the world confirm what she already knew. She was making it real by saying it out loud, in a place where everyone could hear, in the lobby of the hotel where she had been married. Lindsay swung her purse at her father's head. She swung it hard, and she screamed, I hate you. She said it 3 times. 3 separate declarations, each one distinct. I hate you. Pause. I hate you. Pause. I hate you. The 16-year-old girl who had come to Friendswood every summer, who had eaten her stepmother's cooking and listened to her stepmother's voice saying I love you to her father at the end of every phone call, who was now standing in a hotel lobby swinging her purse at her father's head because she had loved him. And he had done this. Hotel employees came in fast. This was what they were trained to do. contain domestic situations with professional calm, and get the parties separated before the situation escalated further. They put themselves between the women. Clara did not stop. She kept grabbing at Gail. The two women ended up pulling on opposite ends of Gail's torn shirt in something that witnesses would later describe as resembling a tug of war. There was nothing coordinated about it. It was pure physical fury expressed through the nearest available object. Then David intervened. He put his hand on Clara's head. He pushed her down to the lobby floor, the man whose photograph was on the waiting room walls, the man who used the word golly, the man who had said, "I love you" back at the end of every one of those calls for 10 years. He put his hand on his wife's head and pushed her to the floor of the hotel where they had held their wedding reception. And then he took Gail Bridges by the arm and walked her quickly through the lobby doors, a hotel employee helping him, moving her out and away from the building to the parking lot where her Lincoln Navigator was waiting. Hotel staff helped Clara up. They were professional about it. They walked her and Lindsay out to the far lot, the other side of the hotel, where the silver Mercedes was parked, and they asked them, firmly and not unkindly, to leave. The situation appeared resolved. The parties were separated. The lobby could return to being a lobby. Clara got in the car. Lindsay got in the car. Clara started the engine. Everything that followed happened in less than 2 minutes. Less than 2 minutes. The amount of time it takes to make a cup of instant coffee. The amount of time it takes to walk from one end of a grocery aisle to the other. Less than 2 minutes. A parking lot. A summer evening. A silver Mercedes. A woman at the wheel. A 16-year-old in the passenger seat. A man in the far lot walking another woman toward a Lincoln Navigator. A Blue Moon investigations camera running in that lot pointed at the scene. A Nassau Bay police officer named Frank Rayner, who would later testify that he had only ever seen a body struck the way David Harris's body was struck in movies. Clara pressed the accelerator. The Mercedes began to move. It gathered speed across the hotel parking lot. Lindsay was screaming from the moment the car began to accelerate with intent. Witnesses heard her. She opened the passenger door while the car was still moving and put both feet on the asphalt, as if the force of her own body could stop the car, as if her weight could anchor it. She was 16 years old and she could not stop it. Nobody standing in that parking lot could stop it. The car was moving, and it was moving toward the far end of the lot where David Harris was walking with Gail Bridges. The front of the Mercedes clipped the rear end of the Lincoln Navigator with a sound that everyone in the area heard. Then the car found David. He was walking. He had not made it to any kind of shelter. He had perhaps 3 seconds of awareness before the impact, and those 3 seconds were not enough. The car hit him. The force of the impact sent him through the air 25 feet across the parking lot pavement. 25 feet. Think about that distance. The length of a large school bus. He was thrown that far, and he landed on the pavement, and he lay still. Clara turned the wheel. She crossed the first grassy median. The car jolted over the grass and the concrete edging. She brought the Mercedes back around toward where her husband was lying on the pavement. The front tires went over his body, then the rear tires. The car continued. She turned it again. She crossed the second grassy median. She came back toward him a second time. The tires went over him again. She turned. She came back a third time. Then she put the car in reverse. She reversed over his body. Then she stopped. The car sat on top of him. The silver Mercedes-Benz that was the record of everything she had accomplished was parked on top of the man who had been the reason she built it. The parking lot was full of people watching this. It was still light. The summer light in Texas in the early evening in July is particular. It comes in low and golden and warm, and it makes everything visible, everything exposed. There was nowhere to look away from. The witnesses were standing in that light, watching something that none of them had ever seen outside of a film. Lindsay got out of the car. She ran around to the driver's side. She punched Clara Harris in the face. Then she collapsed. She went down on the pavement of the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton, and she lay there and she sobbed. A 16-year-old girl who had come to spend the summer with her father and who was now on the ground in a hotel parking lot, having just watched him be run over. And the sounds she made were the sounds of a person whose world has just broken entirely open with no warning and no preparation. Clara got out of the car. She stood in the parking lot in the blue blouse. and the cream slacks with the bow still in her hair. She stood for a moment among the witnesses and the running camera and the fading summer light. Then she walked to her husband. She knelt on the pavement beside him. She took him in her arms and held him, and she begged him to breathe. "I'm so sorry," she said. "David, I'm so sorry. I love you." She said it over and over. The witnesses heard her. The camera was still running. She held a man who was dying, and she said, "I love you, and I'm so sorry, and please breathe." She meant every word. Both the terrible thing she had done and the love she was expressing were simultaneously and completely real. They existed in the same chest, in the same hands holding him, in the same voice saying his name. David Harris died of his injuries that night. Clara Harris was handcuffed by the police, who arrived at the scene and charged with first-degree murder. The Blue Moon camera had gotten everything, not in perfect close-up, not with the clarity of a Hollywood production. The lot was large, and the camera was at a distance, and in places, David was barely visible in the footage. But the car was visible. The medians were visible. The direction and the speed and the returning were visible. You could see it. You could understand what you were seeing. The tape would become one of the most watched pieces of true crime footage in the Houston area for years. It would be played in a courtroom and shown on television and analyzed frame by frame by attorneys and by the public alike. It was the kind of evidence that removes the need for most other evidence. The day after Clara bonded out of jail on $30,000 bail, Bobby Butcher called her. She needed to ask about the contract violation. Clara had been at the site when the contract said she would not be. Bobby recorded the conversation on a small cassette recorder, a standard practice in her line of work. On that tape, Clara's voice is described by everyone who heard it as unnervingly completely calm. She spoke evenly. She confirmed her identity when asked. She asked questions in an organized, methodical way. She asked whether the investigator had been present through the incident. She was told yes. So he was there through all the tragical parts? Clara asked. Tragical, not tragic. The standard word reaching for an extra syllable, as if the standard container was too small for what she was trying to put in it, as if the normal form of the word was insufficient. She also asked, at some point during the conversation, whether she could get a refund on the $1,500. There are multiple readings of that voice and of that question. The prosecution read both as evidence of cold calculation, a woman who had done something intentional and was already managing the aftermath with clinical precision. The defense read them as the voice of someone so far inside shock that the surface had gone entirely quiet, the way the surface of very deep water goes still even when the movement below is violent. Both are available. Neither can be definitively disproven from a recording. You cannot hear a voice and know what is behind it. You can only note that the voice was very calm and that the question about the refund was asked, and let the jury decide what those facts mean. The story went everywhere. The English tabloids called her the driller killer, which is the kind of pun that exists in the space between horror and cheap wordplay. The New York Post called her mad wife at wheel. The morning talk shows reached anyone who had ever been in the same room with her or her husband. The late-night monologues used her as material in the reflexive way they use any story that has a clean enough shape to fit into 90 seconds. When she appeared in court for the first time after bonding out, nearly a dozen photographers were pressed against the barriers outside the building, and the photographs they took showed a woman with dark hair who had once been known for reddish blonde hair, a woman in an elegant teal pantsuit who was staring straight ahead and blinking back tears. The wedding ring was still on her left hand. She had changed her hair color in the weeks between the arrest and the court appearance. The reddish blonde was gone, replaced with dark brown. Maybe she was trying to avoid recognition on the street. Maybe she needed to look at herself differently. The ring she had not changed. After being charged with the murder of the man who wore the matching ring, she still wore her wedding ring. You read into that what you choose to read into it. A woman who cannot yet process that the marriage is over, or a woman who did something terrible to someone she still loved, which are not the same thing and might both be true. George Parnham was her attorney. He had recently come through the Andrea Yates case, defending the Houston mother who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub in 2001. and had emerged as one of the most prominent defense attorneys in Texas for cases involving women who had reached the outer limit of what the human mind can carry, and then gone past it. He said publicly that Clara was struggling to accept that David was gone. Friends stayed at the Friendswood house at night because they feared leaving her alone. What kept her functioning, they said, was the twins, Brian and Bradley, almost 4, who needed food and attention and bedtime, and a mother who was present enough to provide those things. The Houston suburbs discussed the case continuously. Local radio call-in shows were swamped with callers. A significant number said Clara should not face serious punishment. More than one caller said David had made his own fate the moment he chose the receptionist over the wife, and the wife walked into the lobby. Letters arrived at the Houston Chronicle in significant numbers. One woman wrote that Clara had acted out the fantasy of every woman who had learned her husband was having an affair. The letter attracted its own controversy. Gail Bridges went into seclusion. She had broken no law. She had had an affair with a married man who had not been entirely honest with her about the nature of his marriage, and she had been walking to her car when the affair's consequences arrived in the form of a silver Mercedes accelerating across a parking lot. She had survived. Her reputation had not, in the way that happens when a narrative needs a simple villain and someone gets slotted into that role by mass public consensus rather than by any legal determination. Lindsay Harris filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Nassau Bay Hilton for failing to provide adequate security for its guests during a domestic dispute, and against Blue Moon Investigations for allegedly leading Clara to the hotel. Bobby Barcher objected to the Blue Moon allegation. The contract was explicit, she said, and Clara had been there an hour before Blue Moon called her. You cannot keep someone from a public place, Barcher said. Clara knew the hotel. She gave us the address. She was stalking the parking lot an hour before we called. The twins went to live with family friends, Pat and Anna Jones, in Friendswood. They would grow up in the same kind of suburb they had been born into, raised by people who were not their parents, in the absence of a father who was dead and a mother who was in prison. What that grows inside a child, the specific shape of that particular absence, is not something any account from outside can accurately estimate. The trial began in January 2003, 6 months after July 24th. The courtroom was in Houston, and the media presence was extensive and organized, in the way that media presence gets organized around cases with a videotape and a parking lot full of eyewitnesses, and a defendant who was both sympathetic and convicted by the footage of her own act. The question before the jury was interior. It was not what had happened in the parking lot. The tape answered that. It was what had been happening inside the person behind the wheel. Whether those 2 minutes contained a decision or the collapse of the ability to make decisions, Texas law allowed for the finding of sudden passion, which acknowledged that human beings sometimes act in the grip of an overwhelming provocation that arises directly and immediately from the person killed, and that this is legally distinguishable from premeditated murder. It was not a defense. It was not innocent. It was a different kind of guilty, carrying a sentencing range of 2 to 20 years, rather than 5 to 99 or life. The defense wanted sudden passion. The prosecution wanted the jury to see past it to something more deliberate. Mia Magnus prosecuted with the methodical confidence of someone who had a videotape. She built her case around 3 things: the contract Clara had signed and violated by appearing at the surveillance site, the fact that Clara had been in the parking lot before she was called, and Clara's own words in a police interview, in which she had said she wanted to hurt him. Those were Clara Harris's own words, not an inference, not a reading between the lines. I wanted to hurt him. The prosecution placed those words at the center of its argument and built outward from them. George Parnham told the jury that Clara Harris had lost it. He used the word accident. He presented the case of a woman who had loved her husband with extraordinary completeness and had been shattered by what she found in that lobby, and who had been so far outside the reach of rational decision-making in those 2 minutes that the concept of choice did not apply. He pointed to the imperfection of the videotape. He noted that the medical examiner could confirm only a single tire mark on David's body with certainty, which he argued was consistent with a single impact rather than multiple. He pointed to Clara on the pavement afterward, holding her husband, begging him to breathe. A woman who deliberately kills her husband does not then kneel over him and beg him to live. You do not say, "I'm so sorry" to someone you meant to kill. The prosecution's response to that, unspoken but present in the structure of the trial, was the number of times the car had crossed those medians. Private investigator Claudine Phillips, who had been hired the day before the incident, testified that in her brief time working with Clara, she had been struck by the quality of Clara's love for David. "You could tell she really loved him," Phillips said. "The love was visible and real." Clara Harris was not a woman who wanted her husband dead. She was a woman who wanted her husband back and had hired investigators to help her reclaim him. This is the complication that lives at the center of the case and that no legal proceeding can fully accommodate. The woman who loved him most intensely was also the woman who killed him. These things are not in contradiction. Extreme love and extreme violence exist in the same register. They require the same degree of investment in another person, the same depth of opening yourself to someone else. You do not kill a stranger that way. That particular combination of the accelerator and the medians and the circles and the reversing belongs exclusively to people you have opened yourself to entirely, because only a person that deep inside you can cause the kind of damage that produces 2 minutes. Like those 2 minutes. Lindsay Harris took the stand at 17. She was David's daughter, and she was also Clara's stepdaughter, and now she was a witness for the prosecution in a murder trial. She sat in the witness chair in the Houston courtroom, and she told the jury what she had seen and heard from the passenger seat of the silver Mercedes-Benz. She said her father had been terrified, that he was trying to get away from the car and couldn't manage it, that she had been screaming the entire time, that Clara had not stopped. He was really scared. Lindsay said he was trying to get away and he couldn't. She also testified about the week before July 24th, about statements Clara had made in the days leading up to that Wednesday. The specific words were not uniformly reported in press coverage of the trial, but the substance was clear. In the preceding week, Clara had said things that suggested she had been thinking in advance about what she might do when she found them, things that made the sudden passion narrative harder to sustain, things the prosecution used to argue that the calculation had not begun in the lobby or even in the parking lot, but earlier in the quiet of the house in Friendswood, in the days when she was waiting for the investigators to bring her what she already knew was coming. The prosecution pointed to the bow. It pointed to the presence. In the parking lot, before the call, it pointed to the statements from the week before. A woman who is about to accidentally kill her husband in a parking lot does not tie a bow in her hair. A woman who is building towards something does. Or so the argument went. The defense would have said, a woman going to confront her husband at their wedding hotel wants to look the way she looked on the night of their wedding, or as close to it as she can manage on a summer afternoon. The bow was love, not plan. The bow was the act of a woman who still believed, until the elevator opened, that there might be a version of this that did not end in a parking lot. Both arguments are honest. Neither is dispositive. The jury sat with the video. They watched the silver car move through that parking lot in the fading evening light of July 24th, 2002. They watched the direction and the speed and the crossing of medians. They watched the car sit on top of a man. They listened to Lindsay Harris say her father was scared and trying to get away. They listened to Officer Rayner say he had only ever seen a body struck that many times in movies. They listened to the prosecution read back Clara's own words about wanting to hurt him. They deliberated for 7 hours. On February 14th, 2003, they came back. Valentine's Day, the day David and Clara Harris had been married at the Nassau Bay Hilton 11 years earlier. The day that had been the beginning of the story. It was also the day the story ended, in the judicial sense. Guilty of murder. The jury also found that she had acted under sudden passion, which in Texas law triggers the lower sentencing range, and then they sentenced her to 20 years, which is the maximum available under the sudden passion finding. They used the full ceiling of the provision designed to acknowledge human overwhelm, and they filled it completely. Read the structure of that verdict slowly. Jury said, "We understand what was done to you. We're acknowledging it through the legal mechanism that exists for exactly this kind of human situation. And we are giving you the most that mechanism allows us to give you. We are holding you as fully responsible as we are permitted to hold you. We are not letting the grief do the work for you." Clara stood in the courtroom and heard the number. She had been weeping intermittently throughout 6 weeks of trial. She did not visibly react. There may have been by then a kind of exhaustion past the place where reaction lives. George Parnham appealed. The conviction was upheld in the appellate court. The case was legally closed. Clara Harris entered the Texas prison system. She was 60 years old when she was released on parole in May 2018, 15 years into the sentence. The twin boys she had left at 3 years old were 19. They had grown up with Pat and Anna Jones in Friendswood. They were young adults now. She completed her parole in February 2023. More than 20 years after a July evening in a parking lot, the Texas Department of Public Safety noted that she was no longer under supervision. The note was brief. There was nothing more the system was required to say. Let's go back to the morning one more time. Just once more. Because the morning is the whole thing. The morning is where the case lives, not the parking lot. She woke up already knowing. The knowing had been accumulating for months. This is what the narrative convenience of a single day cannot fully capture. That what happened on July 24, 2002 was the last few hours of a much longer process. That the knowing does not arrive on a specific morning. It accumulates. It comes in small increments of temperature change and small wrongnesses and unanswered questions and the measured distance of a man who used to press against you in the dark. It comes before you are ready to name it. It comes before you have any proof. And then it lives inside you, the knowing without proof. And it changes you in ways that you cannot fully account for or defend against. She had the love and she had the knowing, and she had both at the same time, which is one of the most impossible combinations a person can be asked to carry. She loved him. She loved him the way she had always loved him, which was completely and publicly, and with the kind of commitment that made co-workers feel inadequate by comparison. And she knew what he was doing, and the gap between those two facts was where the months of watching and waiting and confronting and trying to believe and failing to believe had been living. She hired Blue Moon. She wrote the check. She signed the contract. She drove home. She got out of bed on the morning of July 24th, and the knowing was there with the first breath, the way it had been every morning for months. She made coffee. She got the twins their breakfast. She managed the morning, and she waited for the phone to ring. When it rang in the late afternoon, and the investigator told her what she already knew, she put on the blue blouse and the cream slacks. She brushed her hair. She tied the bow. The bow. Think about what the bow means. You are 44 years old. You came from Bogota with nothing. You studied and worked and built and crossed an ocean and built more. And you married a man who used the word golly and told you he was completely smitten. And you believed him, and you were right to believe him. And then, somewhere in the spring of 2002, he chose a receptionist over you and started taking her to the hotel where you had your wedding reception. And now it is late afternoon, and the investigators have just confirmed what you already knew. And you tie a bow in your hair. What does the bow mean? It means, I am still this. I am still the woman who built this life. I am still the woman who loves this man. I am still the woman he married. Whatever he has done, I am going to walk into that lobby looking like myself. I am going to be seen. I am going to be recognizable as the person I have always been, in the building where I became his wife, in front of the evidence of what he has done. The bow means, I am not undone yet. She got in the silver Mercedes, the symbol of the whole arc of her accomplishment, and she drove south with Lindsay in the passenger seat and the evening light coming down gold and flat over the Texas suburbs, past the clean sidewalks and the stop signs at every corner, toward the water and the hotel. She may have been there before the call came. She may have been circling that parking lot an hour before the investigators reached her. If that is true, it means the undertow was too strong to resist. It means she had driven south, not because she had a plan, but because the current was pulling her, and she had been awake with the knowing for months, and the waiting in the house had become impossible, and she had to go toward the answer even before the answer was officially given. And then the elevator opened, and the lobby happened, and the floor happened, and David's hand on her head happened, and then the hotel staff walking her out and asking her to leave happened, and then the key in the ignition happened, and then the 2 minutes. happened that the jury would sit with for 7 hours and that none of us, looking at it from outside, can fully enter. She drove back to him. She drove back over him. She stopped over him. She got out and she held him and she said, "I'm so sorry and I love you and please breathe." And she meant every word of all of it. That is the day. That is all of it. The Nassau Bay Hilton is still standing. The parking lot is there. The medians are there. The water views from the upper rooms are the same. The building does not know what happened beneath its lights. Buildings do not keep score. They simply stand. Clara Harris is free. She has been free of the criminal justice system since February 2023. She is 65 years old. The twin boys she left at 3 are in their 20s. Lindsay, who was 16 in the passenger seat, who punched her stepmother in the face and collapsed sobbing on the pavement, is in her 30s. She carries the parking lot with her. You do not watch your father die that way and leave it in the parking lot when you go home. It goes with you. Gail Bridges has lived whatever life she has lived with whatever she carried away from that evening. She was not guilty of any crime. She was in a parking lot. She survived. The story needed her in the villain slot, and she spent years there without much recourse. Bobby Barcher kept running Blue Moon, still serving the constant comment tea, still keeping decorating magazines in the car, still burning the cinnamon candles. "You can't stop it," she said. "People are people. This has been going on since biblical days, but you can get it on tape." That was what the camera in that parking lot had done. And the tape had been played in court, in front of 12 people who deliberated 7 hours and came back on Valentine's Day with a verdict that said, "We see you and you are responsible and the maximum is 20 years and we are giving you all of it." There is one thing left to sit with, and it is the thing the case keeps returning to, no matter how many legal proceedings attempt to put a frame around it. She loved him. She killed him. She held him after. These are not contradictions. They are the facts. The bow was in her hair, and the car was running, and the clock was inside the 2 minutes, and then it was over. In the legal sense, it was over on February 14th, 2003. In the human sense, it is not over. The morning of July 24th, 2002 is still happening in the way that mornings of that kind are always still happening. She is still waking up, already knowing. The coffee is still on. The bow is still being tied in a mirror that shows a woman doing the one small thing that is in her power to control before she goes to find out what has already been true for months. The car is still moving south through the flat Texas suburbs. The hotel is still there. The water view from the upper rooms is the same. The clock ran out on a Wednesday evening in July in Nassau Bay, Texas, in a parking lot in full daylight, with witnesses and a camera and a 16-year-old girl screaming at someone she loved to stop. Nobody stopped. That is the story. That is all of it. That is where it lives. Let's slow down inside the morning, because the morning deserves more than a paragraph. Clara Harris was a woman who had organized her entire adult life around competence. She was not the kind of person who was overwhelmed by things. She was the kind of person who looked at a problem and broke it into manageable components and addressed those components in sequence and produced a solution. She had done this with her education, coming from a country and a family that did not have the resources to make dentistry easy or obvious, and making it happen anyway. She had done it with the immigration to the United States, which requires a different kind of sustained endurance than most people appreciate. She had done it with a dental practice in Lake Jackson, building a patient base in a city where nobody knew her and where she had to establish trust, one appointment at a time. She had done it with the marriage, which she had maintained with extraordinary consistency for 10 years. The calls, the photographs, the "I love you," the dinners on time, the warm relationship with Lindsay, the twin boys she raised alongside a dental practice, and a social life and everything else that constitutes the full weight of a life. She was not accustomed to being a person who could not handle something, and the affair was something she could not handle. Not in the sense that she could not believe it, or could not process it intellectually. She could believe it. She had believed it for months. The handling that was beyond her was the emotional handling, the part where you feel something and you are supposed to put it somewhere, where the competence and the organization and the capacity to break problems into components all fail Because the problem is not a problem with components. The problem is that the person you love most in the world is betraying you, and that cannot be organized. It can only be felt. She had been feeling it every morning for months. Every morning the same thing. The bed slightly wrong, the temperature slightly off, the distance in the air between them that used to be warmth. Every morning, the knowledge sitting in her chest, heavy and specific, and provable by nothing except the certainty of a person who knows the person they love better than anyone else, and is watching that person become someone slightly different than who they were. She had confronted him. They had talked. He had said things. The things he said were not untrue necessarily in the way that things people say when they are in the middle of something and not ready to end it, are not untrue, but are also not the whole truth. He had said he loved her. He said he was confused. He said things would change, and she had tried to take those things and hold them against the weight of what her chest was telling her, and the chest won, because the chest always wins, because the chest is receiving a signal that the words are trying to cancel out, and the signal is clearer. She hired Blue Moon. She went to the office on Bay Area Boulevard, and she sat across from Bobby Backer, and she explained it cleanly, and she wrote the check, and she signed the contract. She drove home to Friendswood, and she got the boys their dinner, and she put them to bed, and she lay in the bed in the house in Friendswood, and she waited for the morning. The morning came. She got up. She made coffee. She went through the motions of the day. She was waiting for a phone call that she already knew the answer to. And the combination of knowing and waiting is one of the worst combinations a human being can be placed in. It produces a kind of suspended state that is not quite real. The actions you perform in that state are real. You make the coffee, you pour the cereal, you wipe the counter, but they are performed from somewhere behind glass. Everything is happening at a slight remove. She checked the phone. She looked at the clock. The suburb outside the window was running on its usual schedule, the sprinklers cycling through their patterns, the cars on the street headed to work or to school or to the grocery store. The ordinary business of a suburb going about its morning, completely unaware of what was building inside the house with the white brick and the $500,000 price tag and the photographs on the walls and the woman in the kitchen making coffee with a phone in her hand. The hours passed. The afternoon arrived. And then the phone rang. There is something specific about the Nassau Bay Hilton that the narrative keeps returning to, and that deserves its own examination. David and Clara Harris were married there. That is the first fact. February 14th, 1992. Valentine's Day. The reception was in a room with views over the water, and the music was right, and the champagne was cold. And the photographs from that night show two people who are completely at ease in their happiness, not performing it for the camera, but simply expressing it. It is the look that people have when they are genuinely certain, when the future feels like a given rather than a possibility. David brought his mistress to the same hotel. This is the second fact. He booked the rooms under an assumed name and paid cash and went back multiple times, multiple returns to the specific building where he had said his vows, where the photographs were taken, where the champagne was opened in celebration of the life he was about to begin with Clara. You cannot explain this choice with reason. You can propose explanations. The hotel was convenient. He liked the water views. It was close to his office. It was the one he knew. All of those are plausible. None of them accounts for the choice completely. There is something in the return to the same building that feels like more than convenience. Something that feels like a man who has not yet made the decisive break from his first life and is, in some unconscious way, enacting the contradiction he is living. The hotel that holds the wedding also holds the affair. The building contains both. Maybe, unconsciously, that felt appropriate to the man who was trying to contain both things inside himself. Clara knew the hotel. She had been married there. She had danced in that room. She knew the lobby and the parking lot and the water views. When the investigators told her where David was, she already had a complete image of the building in her mind. She knew it the way you know places where important things happen to you. She knew it the way you know the floor you stood on when you heard particular news, the lighting of a particular room at a particular hour, the layout of a parking lot where you threw rice at two people in a limousine. She drove there with Lindsay in the car, and she walked through the lobby doors, and she found him and Gail stepping out of the elevator, and the building held both versions of that moment simultaneously. The version from 1992 when the champagne was cold and the music was playing, and everyone threw rice. And the version from 2002 when Clara lunged at Gail and screamed and Lindsay swung her purse and David pushed his wife to the floor and walked out with someone else. Same building, same parking lot, same lobby, same views over the water. That is the architecture of betrayal. It uses the same materials as the architecture of love. In the weeks and months before July 24th, the household in Friendswood had been under a specific kind of strain that neighbors and acquaintances and co-workers could feel, even if they could not name it. Clara had been trying. This is important to understand. She had not given up. She had not accepted the situation and moved towards separation. She was fighting for the marriage with the same focused determination she had brought to everything else in her life. She had books in the house. Lindsay would later mention in her testimony, and the evidence box from the trial included 2 books found in the Harris home about relationship repair and reconnection, getting back together, how to create a new, loving relationship with your old partner, relationship rescue, a 7-step strategy for reconnecting with your partner. Lindsay testified that Clara told her she had bought those books to try to help the couple mend their relationship, or perhaps Lindsay had found them and brought them home herself. The testimony on that point was not entirely clear. What is clear is that the books were in the house, and their presence says something about the state of the household in those weeks. Someone believed the marriage could be saved. Someone was still trying. Clara was a woman who believed in effort. She had always believed in effort. Effort was the thing that had gotten her from Bogota to Houston. Effort was the thing that had built the dental practice from nothing. Effort was the thing that had sustained the marriage for 10 years through the ordinary difficulties that all long marriages contain. If the marriage was in trouble, she would apply effort to fixing it. She would read the books. She would have the conversations. She would find a way. The effort was not enough. The affair continued, and at some point in the weeks before July 24th, something shifted. The trying became something else. The focused application of effort to fixing the marriage became the focused application of effort to finding out, once and for all, what was true. She moved from the books to the phone calls to Blue Moon. She moved from trying to save the marriage to trying to prove what she already knew was happening. The shift feels, in retrospect, like the moment when a person finally accepts that the fire is already burning and stops trying to argue with it. She was not trying to save the marriage anymore. She was trying to see it clearly. The 2 weeks before July 24th included at least one confrontation between David and Clara about the affair. David had apparently said things that were enough to make her try to believe him, or try to appear to believe him, or keep the household functioning while she gathered the evidence she was going to need. During those 2 weeks, he went to work and came home, and the household ran on its surface, and underneath the surface there was the Blue Moon contract with her signature on it, and the phone at her desk in the dental office, and the knowing that would not leave. Lindsay testified that in the week before July 24th, Clara had made statements that were alarming in their implications, statements that suggested she had been thinking about what she would do when she found them. The specific words were not reported uniformly across the coverage of the trial, but the meaning was consistent. Clara had said things in the days before the hotel that pointed towards some degree of anticipation, some mental rehearsal, some preparation for what was coming. Not a plan, perhaps, but something closer to a plan than pure sudden passion would require. This is what the prosecution used. This, along with the parking lot circling, and the signed contract, and the "I wanted to hurt him" in the police interview. 4 data points, each one individually explainable, collectively adding up to something that looked like premeditation, if you arrange them in order. If you arrange them differently, they added up to a woman who had been suffering for months and was building toward an explosion that nobody, including her, could fully predict the shape of. The lobby confrontation lasted longer than the parking lot sequence. It was louder and more people witnessed it, and it had more moves, more exchanges, more of the specific physical detail of 2 women fighting over a man who was standing between them. Clara tore the shirt off Gail Bridges. This is well documented. She grabbed it and pulled, and the shirt came away. The two women were then holding opposite ends of the shirt in what witnesses described as a tug of war, a grotesque symmetry. Here is the shirt of the woman my husband is choosing. Here is who has it. Here is who wants it. Pull. The shirt as a stand-in for the thing being contested. The man, the marriage, the life, the rightness of one claim over the other. Lindsay was hitting her father with her purse during this. 16 years old, swinging a purse at her own father's head, screaming, "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you." The violence of that image is often under-examined in accounts of the case. A teenage girl hitting her father in a hotel lobby because he had done this. Because he had brought the woman to this hotel and stepped out of the elevator with her, and because his daughter was standing there and had to see it, and the seeing of it produced in the 16-year-old girl the same impulse that it produced in the 44-year-old woman, which was the impulse to make contact, to make the person feel the impact of what they had done. David pushed Clara to the floor. He put his hand on her head, the head with the small bow in the hair, and he pushed her down. This is a physical act of force applied by a husband to a wife in a hotel lobby. It was, in the moment, pragmatic. He needed to get Gail away from Clara, and the most immediate way to do that was to remove Clara from the equation by pushing her down. But the act also has its own weight that is separate from its pragmatic purpose. It is the culminating physical expression of everything that had been wrong in the marriage for months. He chose her. In the end, he chose the woman he had brought to the hotel. He put his hand on Clara's head and pushed her to the floor and walked out with Gail. Hotel staff helped Clara stand up. They moved her and Lindsay to the far parking lot. They asked them to leave. The situation appeared to be over. The parties were separated. The lobby was returning to its lobby function. And then the engine started. What happened in that parking lot was witnessed by people who had done nothing to be there. People who had come to the Nassau Bay Hilton for dinner, or a business meeting, or a drink at the bar. People who stepped out into the early evening to get to their cars and found themselves in a different story than the one they had expected to be in. Ordinary people in a hotel parking lot in Texas in July, going about the ordinary business of their evening, and then the silver Mercedes was accelerating across the lot, and the 16-year-old girl in the passenger seat was screaming, and the man was in the air. These witnesses would testify. They would sit in the Houston courtroom and describe what they saw from different angles in that lot, the speed of the car, the direction, the sound of the impact, the sound of the girl screaming, the sight of Clara getting out of the car and walking to the body and kneeling down. Each witness saw a portion of it. Together, they saw all of it. The camera had the rest. Officer Frank Rayner was one of the first police officers on the scene. Nassau Bay had a small police force, appropriate to a quiet suburb. Rayner had been a law enforcement officer long enough to have seen violent scenes, but not in Nassau Bay, not in this particular suburb with its clean sidewalks and its soccer fields, and its confident expectation that bad things happened somewhere else. He would testify at trial that what he found in that parking lot was something he had only seen in movies, not in his actual professional experience, in movies. The disconnect between the suburb and the thing that had happened in its parking lot was total and absolute. Nothing in the visual grammar of Friendswood or Nassau Bay or the suburb south of Houston had prepared anyone for it. The medical examiner would later be limited in what he could confirm with certainty. One tire mark on the body was certain. The geometry of the other impacts was harder to establish definitively from physical evidence alone. The prosecution had the eyewitnesses and the police officer to establish the multiple impacts. The defense pointed to the medical examiner's caution as the ground on which they would contest the number of times the car had gone over David. It was a limited argument, and it did not ultimately survive the testimony of the people who had been standing in the parking lot watching it happen. David Harris was transported from the scene. He died of his injuries. The specific nature of those injuries, the internal damage from repeated impact by a vehicle, is not the kind of thing that requires detailed description. The result is what matters. He died. Clara Harris was arrested at the scene. The handcuffs went on in the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton, while the camera was still running and the witnesses were still standing in the summer light, and Lindsay was somewhere on the pavement, and Gail Bridges was being attended to, uninjured, but presumably somewhere in the range of complete shock. The wedding ring was on Clara's hand when the handcuffs went on. The $30,000 bail was posted the next day. She came out of jail calm. Bobby Batcher's tape recorded the voice of a woman who sounded like she was running a meeting. Who asked organized questions about the investigation? Who asked about the tragical parts, which was the word she used, that specific word with that specific extra syllable? And who asked about a refund? What are you doing when you ask about a refund the day after you have been arrested for the murder of your husband? You are either deeply, completely disconnected from what has happened, or you are organizing the pieces of your life in the only order that your mind can currently manage, and administrative questions are the only questions your mind can currently form, because the larger questions are too large to fit through the narrowed opening that shock leaves. Either reading is possible, both are human. The wedding ring stayed on her hand. She appeared in court in the teal pantsuit, with the dark hair that used to be reddish blonde, and she stared straight ahead in the way of a person who has decided that looking forward is the only direction available. The wedding ring was on her left hand, where it had been since Valentine's Day 1992, at the Nassau Bay Hilton, in the room with the views over the water, when a man who used the word golly said he was completely smitten, and she believed him, and she was right to believe him, and then for a while she was not. The trial ran for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in which the Houston courtroom became the center of a story that had already spread across the country and across the Atlantic, that had been in the tabloids and on the morning shows and in the late-night monologues. 6 weeks in which 12 jurors sat and listened to the witnesses and watched the videotape and tried to determine the interior of 2 minutes in a parking lot. George Parnham made the best argument available to him. He pointed to the love. He pointed to Claudine Phillips testifying that you could see how much Clara loved her husband, that it was visible and real. He pointed to the books in the house, the relationship repair books, the effort to fix what was breaking. He pointed to the moment after, the kneeling and the holding and the I'm so sorry and the I love you. He pointed to the imperfect videotape and the medical examiner's caution about the number of impacts. He pointed to a woman who had been through months of accumulating grief and had been physically pushed to a hotel lobby floor by her husband in the same building where they had celebrated their wedding. And he asked the jury to understand that what happened in the parking lot came from a human breaking point and not from a calculated decision. Mia Magnus pointed to the contract. She pointed to the hour before the call when Clara was already in the parking lot. She pointed to the statements from the week before that Lindsay had testified to. She pointed to the clear, unmistakable statement from Clara's own police interview. I wanted to hurt him. She pointed to the number of circles. She asked the jury to count. 1 impact could be an accident. 2 could be a loss of control. That is not intentional. But 3 impacts, and reversing and stopping over the body, asked the jury to conclude that something more deliberate than overwhelm had been operating in those 2 minutes. The jury heard both arguments for 6 weeks. They deliberated for 7 hours. They came back on Valentine's Day, and they said, both guilty, under sudden passion, 20 years, both. We see the overwhelm. We are giving you the most we are allowed to give you anyway. She served 15 years and was released. She is free now. The twins are in their 20s. Lindsay is in her 30s. Gail Bridges has lived her life. David Harris has been dead for more than 20 years. The hotel is still there. The parking lot is still there. The medians are still there. The water views are unchanged. The bow was in her hair on a summer evening in Texas, and the clock ran out in less than 2 minutes, and the case was adjudicated in a Houston courtroom on a Valentine's Day, and the sentence was served, and the parole was completed, and the paperwork is done. The part that is not done is the part the paperwork cannot touch. She woke up that morning already knowing. She made coffee, she tied the bow, she drove south in the silver Mercedes. She found out what she already knew, and then she did the thing that the videotape recorded, in full daylight, in front of witnesses, in a parking lot full of people who had not come there to see it, and who could not stop it, and who would carry it with them for the rest of their lives, the same way Lindsay would carry it, and the same way Clara would carry it, and the same way the building would. Hold it in its walls, even if the carpet has been replaced and the room numbers have changed, and the next couple who holds their wedding reception there will never know. That is the story. It is not over. It runs on a loop in the place where it happened, and the place where it happened is inside the people who were there, not inside the building. And those people are still alive. She loved him. She killed him. She held him after. The clock ran out on July 24th, 2002. The rest is paperwork. There is a version of this story that people tell themselves, in which Clara Harris is simply a wronged wife who snapped, in which David Harris is simply a philanderer who got what he deserved, in which Gail Bridges is simply the homewrecker who set the whole thing off. These are the clean versions. They sort the people into their assigned moral positions and make it easy to know how to feel. None of them hold up to the actual facts. David Harris was a man who had genuinely built something good. He was a skilled orthodontist and a devoted father, and by most accounts, a kind and warm person. The affair did not cancel out those qualities. It sat alongside them in the complicated way that human beings contain their contradictions. He had made a series of choices over a period of months that were dishonest and damaging, and he had not been able to bring himself to make the clean break that would have required choosing one life and ending the other. He was 44 years old, and he was living in the gap between what he had and what he wanted. And that gap killed him, not because he deserved to die, but because the person who loved him most could not survive it. Gail Bridges was not a predator. She was a recently divorced woman who was making $1,800 a month and working the front desk of an orthodontic practice, and who got along very well with the orthodontist. She made choices she was entitled to make. She was an adult. David Harris was not being fully honest with her about the degree to which his marriage was or was not over. She was not responsible for his marriage. She was not responsible for what happened in that parking lot. She was in the parking lot. She survived. The story placed her in the villain slot because the story needed a villain slot, and she was the most convenient candidate. And none of that is fair to her, and fairness is not what she got. Clara Harris was a woman who loved a man so completely that she could not absorb what he had done, who had built a life on the foundation of that love, and discovered the foundation was not what she thought it was, and could not organize that fact into manageable components, because it was not the kind of problem that can be organized. Who hired investigators and signed a contract and drove south with a bow in her hair, and found them in the lobby and lost the structural integrity that had held her together for 44 years in the space between the elevator opening and the hotel staff, walking her out to the far parking lot. She is not simply a wronged wife. She is not simply a villain. She is not simply a tragedy. She is a person who did a terrible thing in a state of extreme pain, and both of those facts are true simultaneously. And the jury sat with both of them for 7 hours and sentenced her to the maximum the law allowed, while also acknowledging the human context. And even that is not a satisfying resolution, because there is no satisfying resolution to a story like this. There is only the morning, the waking up already knowing, the coffee and the clock, and the bow, and the car, and the hotel, and the elevator, and the lobby and the parking lot, and the 2 minutes, and the holding him after. And then the very long remainder, which is the rest of all of their lives. David Harris is buried somewhere in Texas. His twin sons grew up without him. His daughter carried the parking lot into her adult life. His wife, who is also his killer, is free now. The woman he was walking to her car survived. Bobby Barcher is still burning the cinnamon candles. The Nassau Bay Hilton is still standing. The same building where, on Valentine's Day in 1992, 2 people were completely certain about each other, and where, on July 24th, 2002, the certainty ended. Both evenings happened in the same place. That is the only place the story knows how to end. In the building where it began, in the parking lot where it concluded, in the summer light of a Texas evening that made everything visible and nothing preventable. The clock ran out. The bow was still in her hair. The ring was on her finger. She loved him. She killed him. She held him after and begged him to breathe. That is all of it. That is the whole thing. Every other fact is in service of those 3 sentences. Let's spend a moment on the witnesses, because the witnesses are important in a way that the legal record does not fully capture. There were people in that parking lot on the evening of July 24, 2002, who had come there for completely ordinary reasons. Someone who had parked their car and was walking to the hotel entrance. Someone who had finished a business dinner and was heading home. Someone who stepped out of the lobby to get some air and found themselves in a different story. These people had not signed up for this. They had not agreed to witness anything. They were simply in a public space at a particular moment, and the moment happened around them. What they saw was a 16-year-old girl screaming from a passenger seat. What they saw was a man being thrown 25 feet through the air. What they saw was a car crossing two grassy medians. What they saw was the same car reversing over the man on the pavement and then sitting still over his body. What they saw was the girl running around the car and punching the driver. What they saw was the driver getting out and walking to the man and kneeling and holding him. None of them had ever seen anything like it. That is not an estimate. Every account from the scene, from witnesses, from Officer Rayner, from news reporting immediately after the incident, reflects the same quality of shock. A suburban hotel parking lot, a summer evening, daylight, and something that did not fit inside the visual grammar of any of those settings. They testified later. They sat in the Houston courtroom and described what they had seen from their particular position in the lot. Each of them carried it into the courtroom and put it on the record, and then carried it back out when they left. It does not leave you when you walk out. The image of a man in the air above a hotel parking lot does not leave. The sound of a 16-year-old girl screaming does not leave. The sight of a woman in a blue blouse kneeling over a dying man on the pavement of the hotel where she was married does not leave. The camera recorded all of it. The camera did not feel it. The witnesses felt it. And then they went home, and they did their best to sleep, and Nassau Bay went back to being Nassau Bay, and the hotel went back to being a hotel, and the summer continued in the way that summers continue, indifferent to what happens beneath them. The morning after, Bobby Butcher made her call, and Clara answered in a calm voice and asked about the tragical parts. The morning after that, the Houston newspapers ran the story on their front pages. The morning after that, the tabloids had their headlines. Within a week, the story was in every country that had a tabloid. Within 2 weeks, Clara's changed hair color had been photographed from a dozen angles outside a Houston courtroom. She kept the ring on. She sat in the teal pantsuit, and she stared straight ahead, and she kept the ring on. 6 months later, the trial began, and 6 weeks after that, the jury came back on Valentine's Day and gave her the maximum, and she went to prison. And 15 years after that, she came out. And the hotel is still standing, and the parking lot is still there, and the medians are still there. And none of this is over in the sense that the people who lived through it have not stopped living through it. They carry it the way you carry the things that happen to you in the full light of a summer evening in front of witnesses. You carry them into every subsequent room. They become part of the architecture of who you are. You cannot put them down. The morning of July 24th, 2002 is still the morning it was. The bow is still being tied. The car is still heading south. The elevator is still about to open. The clock is still running. It always will be. One more thing about the bow. One more pass at it, because it is the most human detail in the entire story, and it is the detail that resists the verdict. When the jury found Clara Harris guilty of murder with sudden passion and sentenced her to the maximum, they were doing their job. They were applying the law as they understood it, to the facts as they had been presented. They were reasonable people doing a difficult thing with the tools available to them. The verdict is defensible. The verdict is also insufficient. It is insufficient because the law can determine guilt and apportion punishment, but it cannot determine what to do with a bow in someone's hair. It cannot determine what it means that a woman who is about to drive over her husband in a parking lot first took the time to make a small and careful knot at the back of her head. It cannot determine whether that knot represents premeditation or love or both. It cannot determine what it meant to Clara Harris to stand in the mirror of the house in Friendswood and lift her hands to her own hair and tie that bow. What she was thinking, what she was hoping, whether she thought for a fraction of a second as her hands worked, that maybe when David saw her standing in that lobby, he would remember who she was and what they had and what he was throwing away. Whether the bow was her last argument. The bow was her last argument. It did not work. He walked out of the elevator and he saw her, and then he pushed her to the floor and he left with someone else. And the bow was still in her hair when the Mercedes crossed the medians. And the bow was still in her hair when the police put the handcuffs on. And the bow was in her hair when she held him on the pavement and begged him to breathe. She made it for him. She tied it for him. She was still trying, with a bow in her hair, right up until the moment she stopped trying, and then past that moment too, all the way to the pavement, all the way to I'm so sorry, all the way to I love you. That is the whole story. 20 words. She loved him, she killed him, she held him after. Everything else is context. The clock ran out on July 24, 2002, in Nassau Bay, Texas. The bow was still in her hair.